Glamis Castle has stood in the Scottish lowlands since the 15th century, and its walls are 8 feet thick. Inside those walls, the masonry is dense enough to contain spaces within itself. The Queen Mother grew up here. Princess Margaret was born here. For over 600 years, the same family has held this castle. Even when the Crown seized it, they came back. But for nearly 200 of those years, people whispered that something was being hidden inside. The castle's secret was said to be known to only 3 people at a time: the Earl, his eldest son, the estate factor, no one else. The young men were confident before learning the secret. They boasted they would be the one to finally speak. After the telling, they went quiet. Claude Bowes-Lyon, the 13th Earl, put it this way: "If you knew, you would thank God it was not yours." The architecture has fueled repeated stories of inaccessible spaces. The family has declined to investigate. Whatever lives inside those walls has outlived every earl who knew its name. Every earl who learned the secret was described as never being the same man again, and not one of them was ever willing to reveal what he knew. What follows stretches across 6 centuries, 8-foot walls, and a silence that no heir has ever been willing to break. But before we begin, if there is a dark European story you think deserves to be dragged into the open, write it below. A like or a subscribe goes further than you think. This is a channel that opens doors that were sealed shut for a reason. There is one piece of evidence, a single line in the Scottish peerage records, that no one has ever been able to explain. Keep watching, because what that line says will change how you read every word of this story. On March 18th, 1372, a Scottish king signed away a castle that would keep its secrets for 600 years. Robert II of Scotland granted the thanage of Glamis to a man named Sir John Lyon. It was a reward. Lyon had served the crown well, and the king offered him land, title, and his own daughter in marriage. 4 years later, Lyon married Joanna Stuart. He was dead within 6. The Scotland that produced this grant was a kingdom still raw from decades of war. Edward III of England had died only 2 years earlier, and the border between the two nations remained a wound that opened and closed with each generation. Robert II, the first Stuart king, had inherited a throne won by force and held by loyalty. He needed men around him who could be trusted absolutely. John Lyon was one of those men. The thanage of Glamis was not a gift of empty fields. It was an estate in Angus, in the fertile lowlands between the Sidlaw Hills and the Grampians, where the soil was dark and the winters came early. A thanage carried obligations. Lyon would manage the land, collect its rents, administer its justice. In return, he held it as his own, and his children would hold it after him. The grant was witnessed, the seal was pressed, the document was dated. By 1376, Lyon had married a king's daughter and held one of the highest offices in the kingdom. He was appointed Chamberlain of Scotland in 1377. He managed the royal household's finances. He answered to the king. The match raised his family from service into the royal line. Their children would carry royal descent in their veins. The estate at Glamis in those years was not yet the castle that stands today. Construction of the building in its recognizable form would not begin until around 1400, nearly 2 decades after the grant. What Lyon administered was land, not towers, fields, not turrets. The stone would come later, raised by the family he had founded, but would not live to see grow. The marriage to a king's daughter should have secured everything. The office of Chamberlain should have guaranteed decades of influence. But Scotland in the 14th century did not forgive ambition quietly. Power attracts enemies the way stone attracts rain. Lyon had climbed far and fast. He had land, title, royal kinship in his household, and the ear of the king. In 1382, a man named James Lindsay ended all of it. The quarrel is unnamed. The reason is unrecorded. The surviving public summaries are sparse. The Glamis records give the year, the name of the man responsible, and the quarrel, but little more. Lyon's widow, a king's daughter, was left with a name, an estate, and a family line that now had to continue without its founder. What survives is the absence of detail. The castle's own public history gives the year, the name of the man who did it, and the word quarrel. Nothing else. No location for the deed. No description of the weapon. No record of whether Lindsay faced justice or walked free. In a period when Scottish noble conflict was recorded in chronicles, charters, and parliamentary rolls, the death of the king's son-in-law is recorded only thinly in the public summaries available today. Justice in 1380s Scotland depended on who you were and who you knew. Clan disputes, property feuds, and personal vendettas produced killings that were sometimes prosecuted and sometimes quietly absorbed into the rhythm of noble life. A man could take the life of another man of rank and, depending on the political winds, face judgment, exile, or nothing at all. The absence of a recorded outcome for Lindsay suggests either that the records have been lost or that the matter was settled outside formal courts. Joanna Stuart, the king's daughter, now held Glamis as a widow. Her children were young. The estate needed management, protection, and continuity. She had married into a family that was barely one generation old in its landholding, and now its founder was gone. The grant from her father was still valid, the land still produced, and the obligations still held. But the man who had received the seal and built the household around it was in the ground. What Joanna did in the years after Lyon's death is not detailed in the official Glamis history. The record jumps forward. The next major entry is the construction of the castle itself, beginning around 1400, nearly 2 decades later. Someone made decisions in those intervening years. Someone maintained the estate, kept the tenants, and preserved the family's claim. Whether that was Joanna, or a steward acting in her name, or the next generation stepping forward early, the timeline does not say. The family survived. The name continued. Patrick Lyon, Sir John's grandson, would be elevated to the peerage in 1445 as the first Lord Glamis. The line that began with a royal grant and a royal marriage had outlasted its founder's violent end. But the pattern had been set in the first decade. Power, proximity to the crown, and an early end. The castle began to rise around 1400, and within a century and a half, the Lyon name had woven itself so deeply into Scottish political life that it attracted the attention of the most dangerous force in the kingdom, the crown itself. Janet Douglas married into the Lyon family and inherited its enemies. In the 1530s, she was accused of treason, of witchcraft, and of plotting to use a lethal substance against the king. The charges were political. The Douglas name had become dangerous. On July 17, 1537, she was burned at the stake on Castle Hill in Edinburgh. Glamis itself was seized by the crown that same year. By the time Janet Douglas became Lady Glamis, the castle had been standing for over a century. The 15th century tower house rose from the Angus lowlands in red sandstone, visible for miles across the flat farmland. It had become a seat of local authority and a symbol of the Lyon family's permanence. Janet entered this world through marriage, and for a time she lived in it without incident. Then the politics of Scotland turned against her bloodline. The Douglas family was one of the most powerful in Scotland, and James V feared them. He had spent his early years under the control of his stepfather, Archibald Douglas, 6th Earl of Angus, and when he finally broke free of that guardianship, he turned on the entire Douglas network, with a focused and personal fury. Janet was a Douglas by birth. That was enough. The accusations that followed were built on political revenge, not evidence. The official Glamis history describes them as false. Janet was convicted on charges designed to strip every protection her rank provided. Treason, witchcraft, a plot to bring about the king's death by means of a lethal substance. In 16th century Scotland, witchcraft accusations against women of noble birth served a specific function. A noblewoman convicted of treason might expect imprisonment or exile. A woman convicted of witchcraft could be burned. Janet was convicted on all counts. Castle Hill in Edinburgh, where she was put to death, sits on the ridge leading up to Edinburgh Castle. It was a public space, visible from the surrounding streets and winds of the old town. Janet Douglas died on July 17, 1537, in the long light of a Scottish summer evening. The records give the date. They do not describe the crowd. The consequences for Glamis were immediate. The official Glamis history states that James V occupied the castle from 1537 until his death in 1542. The Lyon family, which had held Glamis since 1372, was locked out of their own walls for the first time in 165 years. James V's occupation of Glamis followed a well-worn pattern of 16th century Scottish kingship. Forfeiture was a tool. When a noble family fell from favour, the crown absorbed their estates, their rents, and their physical properties. The king could use a forfeited castle as a residence, a garrison, or a source of revenue. In the case of Glamis, James chose residence. He installed himself in the Tower House that the Lyon family had built and maintained for over a century. The stone walls that had housed 4 generations of Lyons now housed the man who had ordered the death of a Lyon wife. By the late 1530s, Scotland was being pulled apart from both sides. Henry VIII of England had broken with Rome and was pressing his Scottish nephew to do the same. France, Scotland's traditional ally, wanted James to hold firm to Catholicism and to the Franco-Scottish alliance. James navigated between these pressures with increasing difficulty. His health declined. His political grip tightened. The persecution of the Douglas family was part of a broader pattern of control, a king consolidating power by eliminating anyone who might challenge it. During the 5 years of royal occupation, the castle's internal life is unrecorded. What the walls looked like under a king's household, whether alterations were made, whether the Lyon family's furnishings remained or were removed, none of this appears in the official record. The entry simply notes the forfeiture, the occupation, and the restoration. James V died on December 14, 1542 at Falkland Palace. He was 30 years old. His only surviving legitimate child, Mary, was 6 days old. Scotland plunged into another regency, another period of noble factions competing for control of a child monarch. In the confusion that followed, the Lyon family's claim to Glamis was restored. In 1543, John Lyon was permitted to return. The family walked back into a castle that had been someone else's home for 5 years. The rooms were the same. The stone was the same. But the memory of what had been done to Janet Douglas and the fact that the king who did it had lived inside their walls would remain embedded in the family's story for centuries. And then Shakespeare gave the castle a name the world would never forget. There is no record that he visited Glamis, though the castle's own website notes he may have passed through Scotland in 1599. In the early Jacobean period, he wrote Macbeth, a play usually dated to around 1606, and it opened with the words Thane of Glamis. From that moment, the castle's name belonged to the world. The real Patrick Lyon, 9th Lord Glamis, had been in London since 1603, accompanying James VI as the king claimed his English throne. The connection between Shakespeare and Glamis is literary, not physical. Scholars have debated for centuries how the playwright came to use the title Thane of Glamis in Macbeth. The play was written for the court of James VI and I, a Scottish king now ruling England, and Shakespeare drew on Raphael Holinshed's chronicles for his source material. Holinshed's account of the historical Macbeth included the Thanage. Shakespeare took the name, the setting, and the atmosphere. He did not need to visit. The word was enough. The real Glamis in 1603 was a working estate in Angus, far from the London stages where the play would first be performed. Patrick Lyon, the 9th Lord Glamis, had travelled south with the king as part of the Great Transfer of Power. James VI of Scotland became James I of England, and the Scottish nobles who had served him followed him to London. In 1606, Patrick was rewarded for his loyalty with a new title, Earl of Kinghorn. That same year, the listing record notes the Tower House at Glamis was remodelled. An inscription on the central tower reads, "Built by Patrick, Lord Glamis, and Dame Anna Murray." What Shakespeare gave Glamis was something no architect could build, a permanent association with violent ambition and darkness. Before Macbeth, the castle was a regional seat of a noble Scottish family. After it, the name Glamis carried a weight that had nothing to do with the real family's history. Visitors who arrived in later centuries came partly because of what the Lyons had built, and partly because of what Shakespeare had written. The two stories, one real and one invented, would run in parallel for the next 400 years, each feeding the other. But the castle Shakespeare made famous was about to be rebuilt so thoroughly that there were rooms inside the walls no floor plan could account for. One man inherited an empty shell and rebuilt it so thoroughly that no one since has been able to map what he left behind. When Patrick, the 3rd Earl of Strathmore, inherited Glamis in the late 1600s, the castle was described by a scholar as little more than an empty shell. A tower house, an east wing, and a courtyard. That was all. What he did next would take nearly 2 decades. He directed the rebuilding himself, and scholars would later describe him as his own architect. The castle Patrick inherited had survived nearly 3 centuries of occupation, forfeiture, royal seizure, civil war, and neglect. Cromwell's troops had occupied Glamis in 1650, and whatever condition the building was in before that garrison, the years that followed did not improve it. The east wing, added in 1629, still stood. The central tower, built around 1400, still rose above the Angus plain. But the interiors were stripped. The courtyards were bare. The structure was sound, but the life inside it had been hollowed out. The 1670s were a breathing space. The restoration of Charles II had brought a measure of stability, and noble families across Scotland were turning their attention from survival to display. A castle was no longer just a fortification. It was a statement. Patrick understood this. He looked at the empty shell he had inherited and saw not a ruin, but a foundation. What made Patrick unusual was his refusal to delegate. He did not commission an architect. He did not hire a master builder to design the transformation. He studied the building himself, walked its corridors, measured its walls, and planned each phase of construction in sequence. The scholarly record, drawn from the Glamis Book of Record that Patrick himself compiled, shows a man who understood proportion, materials, and cost. He recorded his reasoning for every decision. Where a wall would go, why would a corridor turn, how a courtyard would be enclosed. The Glamis Book of Record is more than a diary. It combines autobiography, reflection, and unusually detailed documentation of the castle's rebuilding. Patrick wrote it between 1685 and 1689, during the final years of his building program, but it covers decisions made from the early 1670s onward. He was in his 40s when he began the work. He would be in his 60s before it was finished. The record he left behind traces not just a building project, but a man aging inside his own ambition, making decisions about stone and plaster while his children grew up in a construction site, and his finances stretched thinner with each phase. In 1677, Charles II rewarded Patrick with a new title, Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn. The elevation came during the building years, while the scaffolding was still up and the stone dust still hung in the courtyards. Patrick was not building a castle to match his title. He was building a title to match his castle. The two rose together. The scale of the work was deliberate, and it consumed 2 decades. Patrick began with the facade. The old tower house had grown unevenly over the centuries, with additions bolted on as need or money allowed. Patrick imposed order. He designed a new west wing to mirror the existing east wing, creating a symmetrical front elevation that gave the castle a face it had never had. Behind the facade, he enclosed the courtyards, restructured the service buildings, and laid out formal gardens that extended the architecture into the landscape. The red sandstone came from local quarries. Patrick's additions had to bond with medieval masonry, matching the colour and scale of stone laid down by men who had been dead for 200 years. The result was a building that looked as though the symmetry had been there from the beginning. Inside, the transformation was equally thorough. The former Great Hall, a vaulted room roughly 60 feet long and 20 feet wide, received a new plasterwork ceiling in 1621 under the second Earl. But Patrick's program extended beyond decoration into structure. He reconfigured circulation, added new staircases, and created the layered internal arrangement that later visitors would describe as disorienting. Rooms led to rooms. Corridors turned without warning. The deep masonry allowed spaces to exist inside the walls themselves. Patrick documented every decision he made during the rebuild, except one. The heritage record identifies a well room set entirely inside the stone of the drawing room walls, a space embedded within the wall thickness itself. These were real features of the castle's architecture, whatever their original purpose may have been. But Patrick was building a castle that could keep things hidden, whether he intended it or not. He was constructing, room by room, the body that a secret would eventually inhabit. Patrick died having turned an empty shell into what the scholarly record describes as a well-planned mansion surrounded by gardens. He had done it in stages over nearly 20 years, recording each phase in his own hand. The walls he built were thick enough to hold rooms. The ambition extended beyond stone. On December 23, 1685, 2 days before Christmas, a sculptor signed a contract he would not live to complete. Arnold Quellin agreed with the Earl of Strathmore to carve 4 full statues of the Stuart kings, 1 bust of the Earl himself, for a fee of £160, to be completed by June 1, 1686. Quellin was not a local craftsman. He was a high-status Flemish sculptor, part of a network of immigrant artists who had established themselves in Britain during the Restoration. His presence at Glamis reflected the scale of what Patrick was attempting. The Earl wanted his castle to carry the same artistic weight as the great houses of England and the Low Countries. Quellin died in September 1686, 9 months after signing. The scholarly record notes that the contract was evidently completed despite his death, which means either Quellin finished the work before dying or his workshop completed it posthumously. The statues arrived at Glamis. Some remain there today, standing where Patrick intended them, carved by a man who never saw them installed. Commissioning statues of the 4 Stuart kings was a political statement as much as an aesthetic one. It declared loyalty to a dynasty that, within 3 years of that Christmas contract, would begin its long collapse. The cost of the rebuilding is not recorded in any single figure. The Quelyn contract at £160 is one of the few specific sums that survive from the entire programme. The rest, the quarrying, the labour, the timber, the glass, exists only in Patrick's own narrative in the Glamis Book of Record. What is clear is that the work consumed 2 decades of his life. He began it in his prime and finished it as an old man. The castle that visitors see today is substantially the building he shaped, and the document he left behind is the closest thing to a builder's confession that any Scottish castle possesses. Patrick also built a chapel between 1679 and 1683, tucked into the northeast corner. Joseph de Witt lined its walls with panel paintings in 1688. The images were not hung on the walls. They were set into them so that the architecture and the scripture became a single surface. Nearly 2 centuries later, stained glass by Charles E. Mackemper was added. Foundations from the 1680s, paintings from 1688, glass from the 1860s, each layer visible to anyone who enters. The chapel does not hide its history. It displays it on every surface. Other rooms in the castle would not be so transparent. But Patrick's chapel would soon serve a purpose he never intended. On January 4th, 1716, a man who was not a king performed a ceremony reserved for kings. James Francis Edward Stuart walked into the chapel at Glamis and performed the ritual of touching for the king's evil. He was the old pretender, exiled and on the run, performing a political act dressed as healing. The year before, John Lyon had fallen at Sheriffmuir, fighting for this man's cause. The engagement at Sheriffmuir had taken place on the 13th of November, 1715, less than 2 months before the pretender's visit. It was the decisive engagement of the First Jacobite Rising, fought on open ground near Dunblane. The result was inconclusive in military terms, but catastrophic for the Stuart cause. The Jacobite army failed to break through to the lowlands, and the Rising lost its momentum. John Lyon died in that failure. The Glamis records note his death without elaboration. He was one name among hundreds. James Francis Edward Stuart arrived in Scotland in late December 1715, weeks after the clash that was supposed to clear his path to the throne. He landed at Peterhead and moved south through a country that was already losing faith in his campaign. By the time he reached Glamis on January 4th, the Rising had already lost much of its momentum. He stayed briefly. The official record notes his visit and one specific act. He performed the royal touch in the chapel. The king's evil was scrofula, and the ceremony that claimed to cure it was pure political theatre. The ceremony had been performed by English and Scottish monarchs for centuries. It was not medicine. It was theology. By laying hands on the sick, a king demonstrated that his authority came from God. When the pretender performed the ritual at Glamis, he was not healing anyone. He was asserting a claim. Every hand he touched was a declaration that he, not the Hanoverian George I, held divine right. The chapel where this took place was barely 30 years old. Patrick's panel paintings by de Witt lined the walls. The space that had been built for private worship was now being used for political theatre. The pretender stood in a room designed by a loyal Strathmore Earl and performed a ceremony that placed the entire family in open defiance of the sitting government in London. The consequences of the 1715 Rising would ripple through Scottish noble families for decades. Estates were forfeited, titles were stripped, men were put to death. The Strathmores survived, but the visit was recorded. The pretender had been in their chapel. He had touched the sick under their roof. The castle's walls had witnessed an act of treason performed as a sacrament. But before the legend, the family itself would change shape. On 21st December 1767, John Lyon married Mary Eleanor Bowes, the wealthiest heiress in England. Her father's will carried a condition. The the family name must change. The Lyons became Bowes, and later Bowes-Lyon, a hyphenated identity that would carry them into the 20th century and eventually into the royal family. The marriage brought wealth on a scale the Strathmores had never known. It also brought a network of English estates, including Streatham Castle in County Durham and Gibbside in Tyne and Wear, that expanded the family's footprint far beyond Angus. In the 1770s, the 9th Earl remodelled the grounds at Glamis in the style of Capability Brown, removing the formal walls and re-siting the gates. He pulled down the west wing Patrick had built a century earlier and added new kitchens and a billiard room. He also relocated estate workers to a new Glamis village, clearing the immediate surroundings of the castle. The building was being reshaped again, and with each reshaping, the internal geography grew more complex. Rooms were added, rooms were removed, and in the year that followed, the family recorded something in a legal register, in a single sentence that has never been explained. The deaths in the Lyon family were always recorded, but what happened next was recorded in a way that said everything by saying almost nothing. In 1728, Charles Lyon, a son of the Strathmore line, lost his life in what the Glamis records describe as a drunken skirmish in the town of Forfar. There is no elaboration, no context, no story of what the argument was about or who started it. Just a name, a year, and a brief note that he had not survived. The family moved on. The castle recorded it and turned the page. Forfar sits 5 miles north of Glamis, a small burg on the edge of a loch. In the early 18th century, it was a market town, a place where estate workers, local tradesmen, and members of the gentry crossed paths in the same narrow streets. The distance between the castle and the town was close enough to walk in an hour. Charles Lyon would have known Forfar well. He would have known its taverns, its people, its rhythms. Whatever happened that night happened close to home. Scotland in 1728 was still absorbing the aftershocks of the 1715 Rising. The political landscape had shifted. Jacobite sympathies had not disappeared, but they had gone underground. Noble families who had supported the Stuarts were now navigating a Hanoverian world, adjusting their public loyalties while maintaining private connections. The Strathmores had hosted the Old Pretender in their chapel 12 years earlier. That memory had not faded from either the family's record or the government's. The official record treats Charles Lyon's death as a single line. It does not name the man responsible. It does not describe the circumstances beyond the word drunken. It does not record a trial, a conviction, or a pardon. The entry exists in the same flat tone as every other entry on the timeline, sandwiched between the Jacobite visit and the next generation's marriages. A man lost his life in a town 5 miles from his family's castle, and the public record assigned it one sentence. What the entry reveals, despite its brevity, is the texture of the family's life in this period. The Strathmores were not sequestered behind their walls. They were present in the local world, drinking in the same taverns, walking the same streets, getting into the same arguments as the men who worked their land. The castle was a seat of power, but the family was not removed from the community around it. Charles Lyon died in the kind of ordinary unrest that the 18th century produced routinely and recorded rarely. The family had survived forfeiture, political persecution, civil war, and military occupation. They had rebuilt their castle from an empty shell and hosted a pretender to the throne. None of that protected Charles Lyon on a night in Forfar. The castle endured. The family continued. The entry on the timeline remains. He was not the last Lyon to die before his time. But the deaths would soon matter less than what the living were hiding. To understand what could be hidden, the building itself has to be understood. A guest arriving at Glamis for the first time would see a symmetrical facade in red sandstone, orderly and legible. They would walk through the main door and into a corridor. They would turn left, expecting to reach the room they could see from outside. Instead, they would find themselves in a passage that curved into the wall itself, 8 feet of stone on either side, emerging into a room they had not been looking for. The drawing room stretches 60 feet long and 20 feet wide. Its walls are approximately 8 feet thick. Inside that thickness, the heritage record identifies a well room, a space entirely contained within the stone. This is not a legend. This is documented architecture. The thickness is a product of the castle's origins. The 15th century tower house was built for defense as much as for residence. When Patrick remodeled the castle in the late 17th century, he did not tear down the old walls. He built them around them. The medieval core remained, encased in later additions, its mass preserved inside a newer building. The result is a structure where rooms that appear adjacent from the outside may be separated by 8 feet of solid stone. Guests who stayed at Glamis described getting lost in passages that should not have existed. Corridors turn within the wall thickness and emerge somewhere unexpected. Windows sit in embrasures deep enough to stand inside. The heritage record describes these features in the drawing room specifically, noting the deeply embrasured windows set into the full depth of the masonry. Late 19th century antiquarian writing seized on these details, connecting the architecture directly to the long-standing rumour of a hidden chamber. The writer admitted that the rumour had never been solved or satisfactorily explained, but the physical reality of the building made the idea plausible. This is the hinge on which the entire Glamis story turns. The walls are thick enough. The layout is complex enough. The construction history, spanning 5 centuries of additions, demolitions, and rebuilds, is layered enough that spaces could exist between phases, sealed off when one generation's work enclosed another's. The architecture does not confirm the legend, it permits it. Much of what follows comes from later retellings rather than confirmed archives. The distinction matters, but the pattern matters more. In the early 1790s, a young Walter Scott stayed overnight at Glamis and could not sleep. He later described hearing door after door shutting in sequence through the darkness. He wrote that he felt too far from the living and too near the dead. His published account, which appeared in 1830, was the first time the claim of a secret room at Glamis reached wide circulation. Scott did not claim to have seen the room or to know what was inside it. He claimed only that it existed and that the family kept its location secret. Everything that came after, the theories, the monster, the deformed heir, built upward from this foundation. Scott left Glamis, but the story stayed with him long enough to enter print decades later. The documentary seed that would grow into the fullest version of the legend was already waiting in the public record, buried in a single line of genealogy. The Scots peerage records one line for Thomas George, Lord Glamis, and his wife Charlotte Grimsted. On October 21st, 1821, they had a son. The entry reads, "A son, born and died, 21st October 1821. That is all the record says. No name, no cause, no burial entry in the same text. It reads like nothing. In time, it would become the seed of everything. Thomas George, Lord Glamis, was 20 years old when the child was born. He had married Charlotte Grimsted on 21st December 1820, 10 months earlier. The peerage entry records his birth date as February 6, 1801, and his death date as January 27, 1834. He was 32 when he died. Charlotte survived him by nearly half a century, dying on 19 January 1881. These are the documented facts of 2 lives compressed into a genealogical register: marriages, births, deaths, and dates. What made this particular entry different was its context. It sat inside the genealogy of the family that owned Glamis Castle, a castle already associated in published accounts with a secret room and an unbroken refusal to speak. When later writers went looking for a documentary anchor for the monster of Glamis theory, they found this line: a child born to the heir of Glamis, recorded in a single sentence, with no name and no elaboration. The gap between what the record said and what it might have concealed was exactly the right size for a rumour to fill. The theory proposed that the child had not died, that he had been born severely deformed, so physically malformed that the family could not present him as the heir to the earldom, that instead of recording his death honestly, they had hidden him, kept him alive, sealed him in a room within the castle's walls, and maintained him there in secret for decades. The Smithsonian's historical essay identifies this interpretive leap explicitly as part of the legend's internal logic. There is no corroboration for this theory in the sources accessible to this research. The peerage entry records a birth and a death on the same day. Nothing more. But the entry exists. It is real. It is dated. And for the storytellers who came after, that was enough. If the legend needed a birthday, this was it. October 21st, 1821. Thomas George himself died 13 years later. He was 32. The secret, if it existed, was just getting started. By the middle of the 19th century, the rumour had taken full shape. No one published a name. No one produced a witness. No one offered a single piece of evidence beyond that one line in the peerage. The story spread anyway. The mechanics of how the rumour travelled are themselves part of the story. In mid-Victorian Britain, the great noble families existed in a social ecosystem of house parties, country sport weekends, London seasons, and country visits. Gossip moved through drawing rooms and dining tables with the efficiency of a postal service. A story about a hidden heir in a Scottish castle did not need newspapers to circulate. It needed only a few well-connected guests who had visited Glamis and come away unsettled. The castle itself fed the rumours without confirming them. Guests described being assigned bedrooms in distant wings, hearing unexplained sounds at night, and encountering corridors that seemed to lead nowhere. The building's complexity, its 8-foot walls, its rooms within walls, its centuries of additions layered on top of each other, created an environment where disorientation was not a flaw, but a feature. A guest who got lost at Glamis was not experiencing a design failure. They were experiencing the building as it was. And the building was still growing. In 1891, the East Baronial Wing was completed, adding yet another phase of construction to a castle already layered with 5 centuries of building and rebuilding. The heritage record documents this addition alongside the earlier phases: the 15th century tower, the 1606 remodelling, the 1629 East Wing, Patrick's 1670s transformation, the 1798 West Wing rebuild. Each phase left its own internal logic embedded in the walls. Each made the relationship between one corridor and the next a little harder to trace. The family's refusal to speak operated as the most powerful evidence of all. When pressed, the Earls of Strathmore and their representatives neither confirmed nor denied the existence of a secret room. They simply did not discuss it. In a culture that treated aristocratic discretion as a virtue, this restraint might have been unremarkable. But placed beside the physical strangeness of the building and the circulating rumours of a hidden occupant, it became the most powerful element of the story. The family's refusal to explain was interpreted by every generation that encountered it as proof that there was something to explain. The 1880 issue of All the Year Round a magazine founded by Charles Dickens, published a lengthy commentary on the Glamis mystery. The passage, accessed through later reprints, emphasized the persistence of the family secret and described a pattern. Young heirs would boast before their 21st birthday that they would be the ones to reveal the truth. After the telling, they fell silent. Every one of them. The pattern repeated across generations. This was the story's engine, not a single confession, not a document, not a body. The engine was the silence of the men who knew, repeated so consistently across so many decades that it became its own form of evidence. Until one man came closer than any earl before him to speaking, and what he said instead tells you everything an open door never could. One man carried the secret of Glamis for 80 years, and the weight of it never left his face. Claude Bowes-Lyon became the 13th Earl of Strathmore in the middle of the 19th century, and he would carry the weight of Glamis longer than any earl before him. He lived from 1824 to 1904, 80 years. He was born 3 years after the peerage entry that would later fuel the legend, and he grew up in a castle already wrapped in whispered stories. By the time he inherited the earldom, the monster of Glamis theory was circulating through the same social networks his family moved in. A remark attributed to Claude, preserved through the writer Mike Dash in the Smithsonian, runs roughly: if you could guess the nature of this castle's secret, you would go down on your knees and thank God it was not yours. That is not the language of a man protecting an embarrassment. That is the language of a man describing something that had settled into his bones and would not leave. Claude inherited the earldom, and with it, whatever had been passed down through the three-person circle described in later accounts: the earl, his heir, and the factor. He was not the first to carry the knowledge. The published retellings, spanning the middle and late decades of the 19th century, describe the same transformation in heir after heir. A young man would approach his 21st birthday with the certainty that he would handle the truth differently than his father had. He would tell people. He would open the room. He would break the pattern. Then the day came, and afterward, without exception, the young man changed. He became quieter. He became older in his bearing. He did not speak of it. There is no record of an heir ever refusing to learn the secret, or ever breaking the silence afterward. The system operated without defection for the entirety of its documented lifespan. Whatever the secret was, it produced not curiosity, but compliance, not rebellion, but surrender. This is what separated the Glamis mystery from ordinary ghost stories and country house legends. Ghost stories are told to entertain. They circulate freely. The Glamis secret circulated in the negative space of what was not said. Its power came from the visible weight it placed on the men who carried it. Every heir walked in confident. None walked out the same. Claude presided over Glamis for half a century while the mystery reached its peak. Magazines published speculative articles. Houseguests returned to London with stories. The legend was discussed in drawing rooms across Britain. Through all of it, Claude maintained the family's position. But the remark attributed to him suggests the knowledge cost him. The phrasing does not describe a man at peace with what he knows. It describes a man who considers his knowledge a burden so severe that the act of imagining it should provoke gratitude in anyone spared from sharing it. This is not the language of a family protecting a minor embarrassment. This is the language of a man describing something he wishes he had never learned. During that half-century, the secret lived alongside the daily life of the house. The castle was not a ruin or a museum. It was a working estate and a social hub. The Strathmores hosted house parties, entertained guests from London and Edinburgh, and maintained the rhythms of aristocratic country life. The secret, whatever it was, existed alongside dinner services and children playing in the corridors. It was not separate from daily life. It was embedded in it. The men who carried the knowledge did not retreat from the world. They lived in it, carried the weight, and said nothing. It was during Claude's time, or close to it, that the most elaborate attempts to locate the room took place. Servants reported seeing a heavy figure moving through empty corridors at night. A houseguest reportedly opened an unfamiliar door, encountered something inside, left Glamis the same day, and never returned. He died on February 16th, 1904. He was 79 years old. He had carried the knowledge for decades. The 14th Earl, his son, inherited the title, the castle, and whatever had been told to him on his 21st birthday. Claude was gone. The secret remained. It had outlived another Earl. The most famous attempt to locate the room involved nothing more than towels and an afternoon. The story, preserved in 19th century compilations, describes a group of Victorian house party guests hanging towels or cloths from every window they could reach. When they went outside and counted, at least one window, and in some versions several, remained unmarked. It was in a section of the castle they could not access from inside. The method was simple and, in its way, elegant. The guests reasoned that if every accessible room had a window, and every window could be marked from inside, then any unmarked window visible from outside must belong to an inaccessible room. They moved through the castle systematically, opening every door they could find, entering every room that was not locked, and hanging white cloths or towels from every window they reached. Then they walked out onto the grounds and looked up. The exterior is dense with windows. The listed building survey describes a 5-story L-plan main block with a central stair tower, turrets, and multiple wings. The facade that Patrick designed in the 1670s and 1680s was intended to project order and symmetry. But behind that facade, the interior doesn't always correspond neatly to the exterior. Centuries of construction, demolition, and rebuilding created a building where the relationship between inside and outside is not straightforward. A window visible from the lawn might belong to a room that no interior corridor leads to. The West Wing had been demolished in the 1770s and rebuilt between 1798 and 1801, further complicating the internal arrangement. The dining room interiors date to this phase, with later baronial revival work recorded in the 1850s. Each rebuilding added another layer of disconnection between what could be seen from outside and what could be reached from within. The unmarked window was in a section of the castle where no interior passage allowed access. The guests could see it from outside. They could not reach it from within. A room with light and air, but no door. In the retelling, the Strathmores did not explain. They did not open the section. They did not offer a tour of the inaccessible corridor. They responded with fury, which the guests and every subsequent retelling interpreted as confirmation. The unmarked window became one more piece of the castle's legend. But the monster was not the only explanation offered for the sealed room. Victorian and Edwardian folklore proposed 3 different horrors for the same locked door. One version claimed the room held the starved remains of members of a rival clan, often named as the Ogilvies. Another spoke of a recurring vampire birth in the family. A late 19th century compilation preserved these variants side by side, offering no proof for any of them, noting only that they were averred. The Ogilvie legend carried its own internal logic. The story held that during a period of clan warfare, members of the Ogilvie family had sought shelter at Glamis. They were admitted, led to a room deep within the castle, and then sealed inside. Left to starve. The room, in this version, was not a place of confinement for one hidden heir, but a mass grave for an entire group of enemies. The legend proposed that the castle's secret was not a living person, but an old atrocity preserved in bone behind stone. The vampire variant is stranger and thinner. In this version, the family was cursed by a recurring birth. A child born in each generation with characteristics so monstrous that the word vampire attached itself to the telling. The child was hidden, kept alive, and fed in secret. When it died, the next generation produced another. The curse was biological, not architectural. The room was a symptom, not a cause. No primary documentation corroborates the Ogilvy account. The clan conflict between the Lyons and the Ogilvies is referenced in broader Scottish historiography, but the specific claim that men were sealed alive inside Glamis and left to die rests on folklore rather than archival evidence. The late 19th century compilation that preserves the story presents it as one of several explanations averred by people familiar with the castle's reputation, without endorsing any of them. The vampire variant carries no documentary support at all. The void at the centre of the Glamis mystery pulled in every available narrative. The sealed room could contain anything, because no one who knew what was inside had ever spoken. Each generation of storytellers filled the silence with whatever frightened them most. The competing legends also served a social function. They allowed the story to persist across different audiences with different tastes for horror. The Ogilvy version appealed to those who preferred historical brutality. The vampire version appealed to those drawn to the supernatural. The deformed Heir version appealed to those who found medical horror more disturbing than either. All three versions agreed on one point. The room was real. What it held was the only question. In September 1908, a contributor to Notes and Queries published a piece titled The Glamis Mystery. He traced the legend back through decades, connecting it to Scott's 1830 account and to the persistent tradition of a hidden heir. He noted that the story was so deeply established that questioning it felt, in his words, almost impious. He identified a paradox at the heart of the story. The legend survived precisely because it was never confirmed. If an earl had opened the room and shown its contents, the mystery would have ended. If a definitive debunking had been published, the story would have faded. Instead, the family said nothing, and each generation of outsiders interpreted that nothing according to their own needs. The writer understood something that the storytellers before him had not. The Glamis mystery was not a puzzle waiting to be solved. It was a story that could only exist in the space between what was suspected and what was known. Close that space, and the story would vanish. The family, whether by design or by accident, had kept that space open for over a century. The legend entered the 20th century intact, and it was about to collide with the most public family in Britain. The girl who would become queen grew up inside the castle that held the secret. In 1914, the wider conflict reached Glamis. The castle was converted into an auxiliary hospital for injured soldiers. Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, the youngest daughter of the 14th Earl, helped care for the men who arrived. She was 14 when it began. The drawing room with its 8-foot walls became a place where men recovered from injuries received in France. The conversion followed a pattern repeating across the country. Across Britain, great houses and country estates were requisitioned or volunteered as convalescent homes for soldiers returning from the Western Front. What made Glamis distinctive was the building itself. The men who arrived there recovered in rooms that had been built for earls, decorated with 17th century plasterwork, and surrounded by walls thick enough to contain hidden chambers. The vaulted drawing room, 60 feet long, became a ward. The corridors that guests had once found disorienting now carried stretchers. Lady Elizabeth was the 9th of 10 children. She had grown up at Glamis and at St. Paul's Waldenbury in Hertfordshire, where the family also maintained a residence. The castle was her childhood landscape, and when the injured began arriving, she was old enough to help, but young enough that the work shaped her permanently. The Glamis visitor materials emphasize her role in assisting with care during the war years, framing it as a formative experience that would define her public life for the next 8 decades. The war scarred the castle as well as the men inside it. The listing statement notes a serious fire in the upper floors of the central tower on September 16, 1916. Surviving damage, including charred doors and woodwork, is recorded in the listing statement. The fire did not destroy the castle, but it scarred it. The marks remain visible in the fabric of the building, documented by the same heritage surveys that describe the thickness of the walls and the rooms contained within them. By 1918, when the war ended, Glamis had served as a hospital for 4 years. The soldiers left. The family reclaimed the rooms. The drawing room returned to its domestic function. But the castle had been opened in a way that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. Strangers had slept inside its walls, walked its corridors, and looked out through its windows. For a building whose defining narrative was secrecy, the hospital years represented an inversion. The doors had been opened to hundreds of men who came from outside the family, outside the estate, outside the world the Strathmores had controlled for 5 centuries. The castle closed its doors again after the armistice. On April 26, 1923, Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon married into the most public family in Britain. She became part of the royal family. The marriage gave Glamis a new royal connection, and parts of the castle were adapted for Lady Elizabeth afterward. The building survey describes suites labelled for the Queen Mother by name. The castle that held a secret now also held a future queen. The marriage changed everything and nothing. Elizabeth left Glamis as a daughter of the house and returned as a duchess. The castle adapted to her new status. The listed building record identifies rooms specifically converted after the 1923 marriage, including a bedroom and a sitting room designated as the Queen Mother's apartments. These were not new constructions. They were existing rooms, part of the same building that had stood since the 15th century, repurposed and renamed to accommodate a royal occupant. Prince Albert was the spare, not the heir. At the time of the marriage, no one expected him to wear the crown. That burden would arrive later, in 1936, when his brother Edward abdicated and Albert became George VI. Elizabeth, the girl who had tended injured soldiers at Glamis, became queen. But in 1923, that future was unwritten. What mattered in that year was the joining of 2 family lines and the physical transformation of the castle to reflect it. The royal apartments at Glamis became artifacts of the marriage, rooms whose names encoded a political relationship. When tourists later walked through them, they were walking through the intersection of 2 histories: the Strathmore line, which stretched back to 1372, and the Windsor line, which had renamed itself from Saxe-Coburg. During the war, Elizabeth had spent nursing soldiers. The marriage placed the castle's secret in proximity to the crown. The mystery of the secret room, which had circulated among aristocratic gossip networks for a century, now existed alongside the most public family in Britain. Whatever the Earls of Strathmore had kept silent about was now adjacent to the throne. The family's response was unchanged. The silence held. Elizabeth, raised in the castle, familiar with every corridor and every story told about it, entered the royal family without ever publicly addressing the legend that had defined her childhood home. She did not confirm. She did not deny. She carried the Strathmore habit of saying nothing into a new context, where it would be tested by a much larger audience. On 21st August 1930, Princess Margaret was born at Glamis Castle. It was the first royal birth in Scotland in over 300 years. George V and Queen Mary visited. Newspapers reported it across the country. The castle, already bound to the crown through marriage, now held a birth. The room where it happened could be named and visited. The room that could not be found could not. The contrast between what Glamis showed and what it concealed had never been sharper. Glamis now contained two kinds of hidden history. One had been made public and turned into a destination. The other remained sealed, unnamed, and unresolved. The birth room and the secret room existed in the same building, separated by corridors and centuries. One a source of pride, and the other a source of something no earl had ever been willing to name. Margaret herself would later be drawn into the legend. It was said that she once stated there was a secret at Glamis she had never been told and did not want to know. The remark is not firmly documented, but its persistence suggests that even within the royal family, the Glamis mystery maintained its gravitational pull. The secret was close enough to be felt, even by those who had not been told. George V and Queen Mary came to Glamis for the birth. They walked the same corridors that Walter Scott had walked 140 years earlier. They saw the same walls, the same thickness, the same architecture that contained rooms within rooms and spaces that did not appear on any plan available to the public. They came to celebrate a birth. They left a castle unchanged. In 1950, the castle opened its doors to strangers for the first time in its history. Visitors could walk through the drawing room, the chapel, the crypt. They could see the panel paintings from 1688 and the stained glass from the 1860s. Guides told the story of the castle's history, its royal connections, its centuries of construction. They also told the story of the secret room. They had been telling it ever since. The decision to open the castle marked a shift that was happening across Britain. The post-war economy had devastated the finances of many aristocratic estates. Maintenance costs for buildings the size of Glamis were enormous. Opening to the public generated revenue, but it also required the family to curate a version of their own history for a paying audience. They had to decide what to show and what to withhold, what to narrate and what to leave unsaid. The tour route at Glamis moved visitors through a sequence of carefully chosen rooms. Each one told a story of age, wealth, and continuity. Each one was a space the family chose to reveal. The secret room was the reason many visitors came. Guides raised it. Visitors asked about it. The story of the sealed chamber, the monster, the heirs who were never the same, circulated through the gift shop and the tea room and the car park. The castle's official history, its royal births and its Jacobite visits, and its Shakespearean association provided the framework. The secret room provided the draw. The family's position remained what it had been for over a century. There was nothing there. The response was consistent, polite, and absolute. Guides delivered it with the practiced smoothness of a line, repeated thousands of times. They did not elaborate. They did not speculate. They did not offer to show visitors the section of the castle where the unmarked window had been seen. The denial was itself a performance, and it had become as much a part of the tour as the panel paintings. By opening the castle, the Strathmores had transformed their private legend into a public attraction. The secret that had once circulated through aristocratic drawing rooms now circulated through tourist brochures. The audience had changed. The silence had not. Visitors paid at the gate. The rooms stayed closed. Glamis Castle is recorded as a Category A listed building. Its designed landscape is recognised by Historic Environment Scotland as nationally significant, dating from the late 17th century. The property is held by the Strathmore Estates Holding Company. The castle reopened for the 2026 season on March 20th. Visitors arrive. Guides speak. The walls remain 8 feet thick. No one has opened them. The ancient family seat now exists inside a corporate shell. The castle today is a managed heritage site operating within the structures of modern Scottish law and corporate governance. The holding company is registered with Companies House. Its officers are listed. Its filings are public. The ancient family seat, held since a royal grant in 1372, now exists inside a structure designed for tax, liability, and succession planning. The stone has not changed. The legal architecture around it has. Historic Environment Scotland's inventory record for the designed landscape was originally added on July 1st, 1987, and updated with minor corrections in 2024. The record describes the grounds as dating from the late 17th century, the period of Patrick's Great Rebuilding, and identifies them as nationally significant. The landscape that Patrick designed to surround his castle, the formal gardens, the courtyards, the avenues, is now protected by the same institutional framework that preserves battlefields and ancient monuments. Inside the castle, the rooms that visitors walk through are the same rooms that have appeared throughout this story. The drawing room where soldiers recovered during the First World War. The chapel where the Old Pretender performed the royal touch in 1716. The crypt that served as the lower hall of the original Tower House. Each room carries its documented history on the walls, in the plasterwork, in the stone. The building survey describes charred woodwork from the 1916 fire still visible in the upper floors of the central tower. The building preserves its scars. Here is what remains after 6 centuries of silence and stone. The walls are 8 feet thick. The building survey confirms spaces within them. The peerage records a child with no grave. Every heir who learned the secret came out a changed man. And the family, through 6 centuries, 2 world wars, a royal marriage, and a public opening, has never once wavered. The legend persists because the conditions that created it have not changed. The gap between what the building might contain and what anyone will confirm remains exactly where it has been since Walter Scott described it in 1830. Nearly 2 centuries have passed since Scott wrote of hearing doors closing in the darkness. The castle has opened to the public. The family has joined the royal line. A princess was born within these walls. Scholars have documented the architecture in peer-reviewed journals. Heritage agencies have catalogued every visible surface. The secret, whatever it is, has outlived every man who carried it. It has survived the transition from private estate to public attraction, from noble family to corporate holding company, from whispered rumor to printed legend. It is older now than most of the men who kept it, and the family's answer has not changed. There is nothing there, and the secret, if it exists, has outlived every man who said so. The castle stands where it has always stood. The red sandstone catches the light differently in each season, warm in summer, flat and grey through the long Scottish winter. The avenue of trees that Patrick planted in the 1680s still frames the approach. The turrets still break the skyline above Angus. From a distance, nothing about the building suggests that it holds anything other than what it shows. Inside, the tour follows a fixed route. The crypt with its stone-flagged floor. The drawing room with its vaulted ceiling and its walls thick enough to hold a room inside them. The chapel where De Witt's paintings have hung since 1688, where Kempy's stained glass filters light through scenes installed 2 centuries later, where a pretender once laid hands on the sick and called it kingship. The royal apartments, renamed after a marriage in 1923, preserved as they were when a future queen slept in them. Every room on the route has a date, a name, a documented history. Every room is accounted for. The room that is not accounted for is not on the route. Guides mention it. They have been mentioning it since 1950, when the castle first opened its doors to paying visitors. Before that, the story moved through drawing rooms and dinner parties, and the pages of Victorian magazines. Before that, it moved through Walter Scott's published account in 1830. Before that, it moved in ways that left no print, passed between family members and servants, and factors in corridors where no one else could hear. The family's position has not changed. There is no secret room. There is no sealed chamber. There is nothing behind the walls that requires explanation. This has been their answer for as long as anyone has been asking. It was their answer when Scott wrote about hearing doors closing in the darkness. It was their answer when houseguests hung towels from every window and found at least one unmarked. It was their answer when a contributor to Notes and Queries traced the legend back through 60 years of repetition and found it intact, unbroken, and unexplained. The Scots peerage still records the entry. A son, born and died 21st October 1821. One line, no name. The entry has never been amended. The room has never been opened. The surveys have never been published. The family has never wavered. 650 years have passed since Robert II signed over the thanage of Glamis to a man named John Lyon. The family has held the castle through violent loss, forfeiture, civil war, fire, and 2 world wars. They have married into the royal line. They have opened their doors to the public. They have answered every question put to them about the room in the walls. The secret has outlived every one of them. Every earl who learned the secret was described as never being the same man again. Not one of them was ever willing to reveal what he knew. None of them ever will.